Biebrza National Park. Biebrza National Park is named after the Biebrza River. The lowland stream, flowing leisurely in northeast Poland, marks its 165-kilometer course with countless meanders and old river channels. Biebrza National Park is an area harboring natural and near-natural wetland ecosystems and forest flora. Its unique vegetation provides shelter, feeding and breeding grounds to many rare wildlife species of birds and mammals in particular. The history of nature protection on the Biebrza goes back to 1921, the time of enactment of the nature reserve Grzędy. 4 years later, the reserve Czerwone Bagno, Red Marsh, was created. In the early 1980s, the two nature reserves were joined together and sometime afterwards raised to the status of a landscape park. Finally, in 1993, the area received the highest protection status, becoming Biebrza National Park. At present, the national park includes 3 basins of the Biebrza Valley, the upper basin in the north, the middle, and the lower basin in the south. With a surface area of 59,223 hectares, Biebrza National Park is the largest of its kind in Poland, one of the largest national parks in Europe. The time of Earth. The landscape on the Biebrza, as we know it at present, was formed around 100,000 years ago. At that time, the land in northeast Poland lay under a great ice cover. The glacier had brought with it not only vast masses of ice, but also a huge deposit of boulders, clay, sand, and gravel. When the climate grew milder, the ice melted, releasing great volumes of water, which gradually formed an extensive lake. At last, the pressure exerted by these waters burst the banks of the reservoir in the region of the present town of Łomża. Meltwater, surging from the lake, flooded across vast tracts of land. The land on the Biebrza was given its new form. Another ice age followed, and the glacier finally retreated relatively recently, only 10,000 years ago. The valleys of the present-day Narew River, of which Biebrza is the main tributary, and of the Biebrza itself, continued to take shape. All throughout the period of milder climate which followed after the Ice Age, the Biebrza has been carving its bed, forming the landscape familiar to us today. The time of plants. Freed by the spring sun from the fetters of ice and snow, the waters are moving again. This is a sign for the rich plant life on the Biebrza to wake from winter slumber. The growing season begins. A special feature of the Biebrza Valley is its striking pattern of vegetation zones. Closest to the river channel, we find a zone of rush vegetation. The stems of these plants have special air spaces in them, which help the plants endure lengthy inundation. No matter how high the water level, the plants are still able to carry on gaseous exchange. No matter how high the water level, the plants are still able to carry on gaseous exchange. Tough roots help the plants to grip well onto their substrate, to withstand the pressure of the water flow. The most popular species here are the common reed and the floating manna grass. The next zones are tall sedge mires. The main species are the perennial sedges. Tufted sedge prevails, forming large tussocks. Communities of low-growth willow and birch also prosper upon the river. Conditions improved, especially when hay cutting in the fens became very rare. The next vegetation zone is that of low sedges and mosses. It is never reached by nutrient-rich floodwaters. As such, it is less fertile, but subsurface water is found just below the ground level. It helps to nourish a thriving population of mosses and low sedges, of which the main species is string sedge. Another typical plant is marsh cinquefoil. The vegetation nearest to the valley margin is the alder swamp forest. Here, water remains on the site for long periods. Alder trees grow as if perched on clumps, resembling diminutive islands. The spaces in between are colonized by rush vegetation, such as bog sedge. The blackberry alder swamp takes its name from the blackberry plant, which is never far away. Farthest from the river channel, there are coniferous and broad-leaved forests, ecosystems not associated with the wetland zone. Biebrza National Park harbors stands of pine, mixed coniferous forests, as well as lime and hornbeam. The Biebrza is rich in many types of peatland. The largest area is under fen peat. Its formation takes place in valleys of sluggishly flowing rivers where the level of subsurface waters is very high. The plants have adapted to seasonal waterlogging and oxygen shortage in the soil. Decomposition of plant matter by bacteria and fungi is never complete. Over the centuries, the poorly decomposed matter gradually forms a deposit of many layers. The resulting layer of organic peat may be a few meters thick. Areas of fenland typically support plants such as the common reed, various sedges, grasses such as swamp meadowgrass and velvet bent, milk parsley, and diverse moss species. Bog peat forms in entirely different conditions. It develops in areas of lower-lying ground, having an impermeable substrate, never nourished by nutrient-rich floodwaters or groundwater. The only source of feeding is from precipitation, which contains negligible amounts of mineral substances. Plants in raised bogs have adapted to this nutrient-poor, highly acidic environment. The main species in here are sphagnum mosses. Before they turn into bog peat, the mosses form spectacular cushions. Other plants typical for raised bogs are wild rosemary, cranberry, and northern bilberry. Another characteristic feature of the Biebrza landscape is tracts of mineral ground rising from the marshes. The meadows stretching at their foot occasionally produce floristic gems such as devil's bit. Depending on their fertility, the patches of mineral soil support pine or mixed conifer and deciduous forests, or stands of lime hornbeam. Towering old trees are useful as nesting places for large raptors, the lesser and greater spotted eagles. Nests of the black stork are encountered as well, even those of the white-tailed eagle. The time of animals. Spring. A lone elk is starting on a new day. Excellent swimmers, elk in search of succulent aquatic plants, are able to dive to the depth of several meters. The elk will be our traveling companion in our ramble across the Biebrza wetlands. The nature on the Biebrza assails all the senses. The morning is filled with gaggling, crackling, whistling and booming. But most of all, the flapping of 1,000 wings. The onset of springtime on the Biebrza is the time of arrival of countless birds. No less than 274 species have been observed in the national park. Nearly 180 fly into the area to breed. Of these, 27 are species threatened in Europe with extinction. The impressive roll call of birds nesting on the Biebrza ranges from the exceedingly rare Aquatic Warbler through great snipe, jack snipe, pintail and black grouse, to common crane, curlew, black-tailed godwit, redshank, common snipe and numerous other species. 30 years ago, the Biebrza became the nesting site for the first pair of whooper swans in Poland. Before flying on to Siberia, ruff linger on the Biebrza to gather strength. After an exhausting journey from warmer climes, mute swans, various waders, ducks and geese get ready for the breeding season by intensive feeding. The wintertime bands of roe deer have now dispersed, and the animals will lead a solitary life during the next few months. One by one, the cranes fly in from far-off Spain. A pair continues in a permanent union until the demise of one of the partners. The roe deer have yet to shed their light brown winter coats. But the black-tailed godwits and ruffs are getting ready for the breeding season. Among the ruffs, only the female shoulders the burden of caring for the young, but among the black-tailed godwit and lapwing, both parents share in this important job. Male ruffs in their splendid display attire try to compete for the attention of the much more modestly looking female. In his hunt, the royal white-tailed eagle appears to have two uninvited attendants, a hooded crow and a female Marsh Harrier. In fact, the two are doing their best to chase the raptor from their own nests hidden nearby. The white-tailed eagle hunts on regardless. Reassured by this turn of events, the hooded crow is hoping for some pickings from the royal table. In the warm, shallow pools, the amphibians are busy mating. In the Biebrza Park, this group of vertebrates includes two species of toad, the common toad and the common fire-bellied toad, and a number of frogs, the grass and the moor frog, and the European green tree frog. Only during the mating season are the frogs and toads the main prey of the white stork. Later in the season, its diet will include small rodents, nestlings, reptiles, and larger insects. The white-winged black tern and the black tern are making ready to breed. The largest populations of the two species in Poland come to nest during years marked by high water levels. The lekking male black grouse is hoping to attract a prospective female. Among the black grouse, only 10% of all males may count on being chosen by a female and fathering progeny. No wonder that the black cock puts all his heart into the lek. The Biebrza wetlands, which continue to harbour 150 cock grouse, are the largest refuge for the species, rapidly becoming scarce across Central Europe. The grey heron is also making ready to breed. Building its nests in high trees, the birds protect their eggs and their young from attack by the raiders on the ground below, wild boar and foxes. The redshank chooses to nest among the low grasses. In this environment, its spotted coat acts as perfect camouflage, making it unobtrusive to predators. The lapwing has made its nest nearby. As with other nesting on the ground, its eggs are coloured for maximum safety. Also close by, we find the nest of the curlew. This rare inhabitant of peatland and wet meadows from the plover family lays 4 large pear-shaped eggs. The grasses, sedges and thickets are a nesting area for the passeriforms, Aquatic Warbler, the reed bunting, the yellowhammer. The unassuming Aquatic Warbler is the true gem on the Biebrza. Outside the area, the species is encountered in larger numbers only in the vast wilderness of the Pripyat marshes. At the end of the day, the elk serenely ruminates on the soft and juicy willow twigs and grass stems. Summer. The cool summer morning on the Biebrza resounds with a polyphonic chorus of birds. The sated elk is observing the unhurried spotted eagle getting ready for the hunt. The Biebrza is a haven for the lesser and the greater spotted eagle, their only nesting ground in Poland. Spotted eagles prey on unexpectedly small victims, frogs and small rodents. They swoop down with an astonishing velocity of over 100 kilometers per hour. Elk are usually solitary. Young bulls may occasionally choose to assemble in loose bands. Their antlers are still growing, sheathed in soft velvet. Only in autumn will the antlers reach their final size, shed for good in midwinter. Summer is the time when the life of the many-colored hosts of insects, spiders, and thousands of other invertebrates is at its best. The flashy butterflies are the most eye-catching of all. There are 659 species, only 93 of them diurnal. The Biebrza harbors species such as fritillaries and vassinids, burnet moths and foresters, blues, coppers, and hairstreaks. The invertebrate world on the Biebrza is not as well documented as that of birds, for instance. Every year brings new discoveries. In the fastness of tufted sedges, the aquatic warbler is feeding its chicks. The mating system of these birds is highly unusual. Individual males may have fathered the young in several different nests. It's remarkable that in a single nest, each of the chicks may have a different father. Only the mother cares for the young. Less watery areas are frequented by nesting larks. Having fed its chicks, the adult bird waits for a while before removing their droppings from the nest. The smell could attract the unwelcome attention of predators. The rare black stork, nesting in the forest fastness, and the common white stork alike, must search for food for their young. Shuttling between the nest and the feeding ground, the adults cover several score kilometers every day. On a tall pine tree near the forest margin, a solitary buzzard chick waits patiently for its parents to return. Hopefully they bring food from the nearby peatland. A vole, shrew, small bird, or perhaps a lizard. In its trek across the mire, our companion elk has stumbled upon a family scene of Marsh Harriers. Still airborne, the male Marsh Harrier passes its catch to the female to be offered to the young in the nest. On a steep riverbank face, the sand martins are hard at work feeding their nestlings. Today's menu consists of small insects teeming over the river surface. Autumn. Autumn is a season of departures. Soon, the peatlands will be empty of most bird life for long months. The first birds take flight as early as August, but the busiest season has yet to come. For his part, the lone elk is making ready for the mating season, which begins in early September. The birds, which like the crane will soon start on their journey, are busy stocking up before they take flight. The permanent residents of the Biebrza marshes, the pheasant, jay and magpie, also need to make ready for the winter. Some of the chaffinches will depart, others will stay behind, but regardless of their plans, all are busily feeding. When the groundwater tables dropped and parts of open peatland became drier and colonized, the Biebrza became accessible to the red deer. Their characteristic bellowing, especially in autumn, echoes across the valley. For the wolf, autumn is the time of great pre-winter hunting. Several of these large carnivores live on the Biebrza marshes. They prey mainly on the red deer, especially on calves and females. A powerful bull and his harem are able to produce up to 10 young in a year. Of these, only 6 on average will live out their first year. The hinds form herds of some dozen or so animals, made up of females and their young. Only during the mating season will the herd be joined by the males. Autumn is the mating season for the elk, which the competing bulls advertise by making a characteristic booming sound. The Biebrza River was probably named after the beaver, which used to be plentiful in its waters. But the gregarious animals had been hunted to extinction long before the outbreak of World War II, prized for their pelts and meat, eaten during periods of fast as a substitute for fish. In the late 1940s, the first beaver family was reintroduced in the moats around the fortress at Osowieck. The animals multiplied quickly, and at present occur in quite a number across the entire river valley. As time passes, growing numbers of birds set off on their annual journey. The sky is crisscrossed by airborne formations of swans, wild geese, duck and cranes. Not all the birds of a given species leave the Biebrza at the same time. Some stragglers may still be encountered late in November. Winter. It may happen that already at the end of November, Winter has descended on the Biebrza marshes. Probably nowhere else in Poland is the climate as harsh as in this watery corner of the country. Snow cover remains on the ground for over 100 days, and the vegetation season lasts just 6 months, one of the shortest in the country. In winter, life centers around the river. The Biebrza is home to no less than 36 fish species. The river waters support the vegetarian beaver, as well as that skillful fish hunter, the river otter. The American mink, for its part, is a general predator. Otters are territorial animals, keeping to their individual territories on the riverbank, each of them several kilometers long. The diving otter is able to stay underwater without surfacing for as long as 4 minutes, able to swim as fast as 12 kilometers per hour. It is able to catch no less than 1.5 kilos of fish, all in a day's work. The American mink is a recent arrival on the Biebrza. Since it entered the area 4 decades ago, it found favorable conditions and multiplied rapidly. It now poses a threat to the local species. Areas colonized by the mink have been losing their muskrat and water vole populations. Some of the birds nesting close to the river channel have suffered as well. The young white-tailed eagle, wheeling majestically, is on the lookout for failing animals. Severe winter is forcing many of the elk to move from their river fastness to the more sheltered woodland nearby. The winter stillness is broken by the characteristic cawing of the raven. For this omnivorous scavenger and predator, winter is the ideal time for successful hunting. By the end of November, the waxwings have flown in from northern Europe. They are said to be named after the waxy berries of the mistletoe, their staple food. Against the snowy white backdrop, the red underside of the bullfinch male appears even more striking. Stark wintry weather poses a challenge also for the full-time resident on the Biebrza, the partridge. Not even the most crippling frost can dissuade the male black grouse from his hopeless amorous display. Twilight is falling. The elk is ready to turn in for the night. The short winter day seems equally monotonous as his winter meal, made up mostly of pine twigs. The time of humans. Farm buildings and villages on the Biebrza have a flavor of their own. A distinct form of village layout may be observed at Jagłowo. The village houses are all lined along the main village street. Similar architecture is known also across the border to the east in Belarus. It used to be typical for rural settlements of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Traces of human presence on the Biebrza go back more than 11,000 years. The first inhabitants known to us by name were the Yatwings, a people of Balt stock. The heartland of their territory was found some 100 kilometers to the north of the Biebrza, in the region of the present-day settlement of Szurpiły. But archaeologists continue to find evidence of Yatwing presence on the Biebrza too. Yatwings inhabited the northeastern corner of today's Poland for 1,000 years. Their name eventually disappeared from the map of Europe in the 13th century, when after a series of bloody wars, Yatvinks succumbed to their more powerful neighbours. The next people to settle the Biebrza area were the Slavs. Archaeological remains of their stronghold from the early medieval period survive near the town of Wiesna. During the Middle Ages, local rulers began granting the peasants the right of harvesting hay from the fens on the Biebrza. The amount of hay allowed per farmer was between 40 and 60 ricks, output from 150 to 250 hectares. This practice, continued over many generations, was mainly responsible for the development of the distinct vegetation in the Biebrza Valley. The Biebrza was always the meeting ground for different peoples and religions. This is evidenced best by places of worship, still to be seen in the area. The Russian Orthodox Church at Yachno, the late 18th century Roman Catholic Church at Yaminy, the place of worship of the Old Believer Orthodox dissenters at Gabowy Grądy, and a Roman Catholic church built in 1610, the oldest in the region. Even today, in the area around the town of Osowiec, may be seen the remains of a mighty fortification raised at the close of the 19th century by Tsarist Russia to protect the western border of the empire against its Prussian neighbour. The tunnels of the defunct fortress now provide a winter refuge to numerous species of bats. Across the ages, humans continued to interfere with the environment on the Biebrza. They cut hay in the marshes and put cattle out to pasture, all of which helped to create a haven for nesting birds. A much less favourable development was the introduction of drainage systems, which with time led to the disturbance of the natural water regime. One of the major challenges facing the national park is to sustain the centuries-old habitat system, a tough task, considering that more than 40% of the park's area is in private hands.
Pierwszy raz zobaczyłem właśnie Biebrze w połowie lat 60.
I saw the Biebrza for the first time in the 1960s and immediately fell under its spell. I couldn't help coming back.
I jakie okazje miałem, to każdą okazję wykorzystywałem.
Today it's changed beyond recognition. All the stone-built houses have suffered greatly because most of them had thatch roofs. With each winter, the number of the no longer tended thatching becomes smaller and smaller. Another highly distinct feature of the Biebrza landscapes were the hay rigs. They too have all disappeared. This happened literally during the last decade. Today the farmers want the good life. In the old days, the great expanses were cut by men standing knee-deep in water. The hay had to be taken out to be stored in ricks on higher-lying ground. Only in winter-time, the farmers came over the ice with sleds to take their hay to the villages. If there was no ice, this had to be done by boat. Nowadays, no farmer wants to cut hay with a scythe, wading in water for weeks on end. So the areas not accessible by tractor are no longer harvested. And here is the real irony. Nature is suffering from human non-interference. When the fens were cut for hay, birds were much more abundant. The paradox is that one place still teeming with birds is the village of Brzostowo, where cows and horses continue to graze and farmers go about their business. And upstream towards Osowiec, an area which has gone wild again, there are far fewer birds. This shows you that nature and man can live in a symbiosis.
występuje.
The great challenge for the Biebrza National Park is to stop the progress of succession, that is, the invasion of open peatland by shrubs and trees. The other challenge is restoring the water regime to the state it was in several decades ago. Encroachment of woody vegetation on open peatland is a serious problem. Willow and birch growth is moving into areas occupied previously by sedge and moss sedge communities. And the survival of the aquatic warbler, great snipe, and many other waterfowl species depends on the survival of the open expanses. An inventive method of management developed by the Biebrza National Park, aimed at preserving open fenland for the birds, is the project The Happy Cows from Brzostowo. Farmers from the village of Brzostowo were invited to graze their cows in the national park. The happy cows are content to feed not only on the grasses, but also on young tree seedlings, helping to arrest succession. The enterprising ruminants set out to pasture make their way across the Biebrza to the meadows on the other bank. At the end of the day, they find their way back home on their own. One method of preserving the open peatland of Biebrza National Park may be by cutting them for hay. The method is promoted by organizing the Poland-wide Haymaking in the Fens Championship. Its purpose is to revive the traditional methods of cutting hay, but the sheer area which needs to be harvested by the park services is staggering. The traditional method of haymaking is simply not enough. Open peatland needs to be cut with mechanized equipment, which must comply with stringent criteria defined by the park. It needs to be lightweight, so as not to damage the surface of the peatland, and operate in demanding conditions, on snow, ice and water. Needless to say, harvesting must avoid the nesting season. Another major challenge facing the park authorities is the water regime, disturbed by human activity. A real battle for water is on at present. To begin with, environmentalists want to revive the water flow in the nearly defunct original riverbeds of the Elk and the Jegrznia, tributaries of the Biebrza. It's a real cliché to say that wetlands cannot survive without water. Studying sources of water is vital for determining whether the wetland is under serious pressure or not, and what may happen to its future. In principle, the Biebrza peatlands are nourished from two sources: subsurface water, flowing from the nearby upland, and the surface waters of the Biebrza, particularly when the valley bordering on the riverbed is inundated during flood events. The survival of wetlands doesn't depend on these two types of water and their origin alone. It's also vital that water remains in the area for a time, that it takes time to drain off. Increasingly, intensive drainage caused by agriculture, insistence on ever larger outputs of hay and pasture for livestock, the pressure to drain the hay meadows, will all cause increased runoff from the area, putting serious pressure on the sensitive wetland ecosystem. The richness of its bird refuges, the diversity of vegetation zones, and the sheer vastness of its swamps, fens and bogs all make Biebrza National Park unique in Europe. Next to the birds, which return each year from far-off places to feed and raise their young, the Biebrza continues to attract people from all over the world. They come to commune with a world of nature all but gone outside the Biebrza Valley.